Welcome back to the YouTube channel. Appreciate you guys tuning in as always. Today we're going to be talking about Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis chapter 39. We're going to look at the subject of lust, pornography, temptation, sin, how Joseph responded to these things that were placed in front of him. Where was his focus? What was his priority? So that is the goal for today, is to look at Joseph's life and how we can apply some of his actions and priorities to our life. So I'm going to hop right into this. Genesis chapter 39 is Joseph and Potiphar's wife. But I guess before I jump into this, I kind of want to paint a picture for us. So before this text, Joseph was a very highly favorable man in anything that he did. His brothers were jealous of him, and ultimately they bullied him and they wanted him dead, but they thought it would be better to sell him off. So that brings us to now, so let's do this. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph. That's important for us to note, that the Lord was with Joseph, and Joseph knew that, and he was with God constantly. That is one attribute that we should take from Joseph, is that he knew the Lord was always with him, no matter if he was in the ups or the downs. Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. I want to pause here. That's important for us to note and just look at for a moment. We see Joseph blessing this household because of his faithfulness and obedience to Christ. We see Potiphar taking favor in Joseph because of how hard he works, and he's seeing the Lord is blessing everything Joseph touches. Now we see the first, I guess you could say, temptation within this success. We see Potiphar's wife making advances at Joseph. How does Joseph respond? He refuses. He refuses what this temptation is, what Potiphar's wife is trying to make him do. It's important that we learn from this. In whatever sin or temptation that we face, whether it's lust or pornography, we have to refuse it. Okay? We can't give it the time of the day. We have to know our stance with God. And ultimately, we're going to get into this in a minute. We have to be so prideful when it comes to not sinning against God. We have to stay away from these wicked things because we know ultimately how detrimental they are to us. And we know that God is with us and he will protect us. Let's continue to read. Verse 8, but he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. Verse 10 is huge for us too, because we see that temptation, and then this context, Potiphar's wife reached out, pursued Joseph day in and day out. And for us, this temptation is always going to be around us. It's hard, to watch TV or watch movie and not see sex, not see provocative images. It's always going to be around us. It's how we respond to those things. We see Joseph know his stance with God. He knows he's taking pride in not sinning against God. He's putting away these wicked things, and he's continuing to be faithful and obedient to Christ, to God. Verse 11 says, one day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. So we see Potiphar's wife, again, try to pursue Joseph to convince him to sleep with her. And how does Joseph respond this time? He runs. He flees from this temptation, from this sin, because he knows how detrimental it would be to his soul and his God, his creator. And this is how we should react too. We need to run from sin. We can't give it the time of the day because we know deep down how detrimental it is to our soul and our faith, and ultimately how it reflects our obedience to God. And we know that Joseph prioritized his relationship with God over temporary success, temporary indulgence, temporary gratification. So that should be our same stance with this sin, with this temptation. We have to run from it. And I won't read anymore, but ultimately, because of Potiphar's wife, she had the cloak because Joseph ran away. She shows it to the guards. She shows it to Potiphar, and ultimately Joseph ends up in prison. But we constantly see this trend of Joseph going through ups and downs. But what's the constant? His faithfulness and obedience to God. He knows that God is with him and that no matter what, he has joy and peace in God because of what he's doing in his life, and he knows what he's going to do ultimately. And we see Joseph in prison now, so he's currently in the pit. But what happens? Joseph gets favor with Pharaoh, the who's who of Egypt in a sense, and then ultimately Joseph becomes the leader of the whole land of Egypt. And then we see Joseph show grace and mercy to his family who wanted him dead, and they bow to him, and Joseph takes them out of famine. And then ultimately, because of Joseph's faithfulness and obedience, we see the lineage of ultimately Jesus' family become a thing, right? If Joseph would have made one drastic sin, it could have changed this forever. But because of Joseph's faithfulness and obedience and knowing God is with him through it all, we get to the person of Christ, and we know what Christ did. So the question for us is, are we walking in the Spirit or are we walking in the flesh? Number 2, how are we responding when temptation comes? Are we refusing it? Are we running away from it? Are we taking so much pride in not sinning against God? Or are we falling into it? What do we need to do to not fall into it? And number 3, if we were truly faithful and obedient to God in Christ, what could he do with our life? What would our life look like? We see what Joseph's life looked like. What could our life look like if we were truly obedient and faithful to God? So I hope we can all take something from this. It's a powerful story, and it's the first book in the Bible. So just know that the Old Testament scriptures can show us great things just as much as the New Testament. But I really hope that this resonated with you and you can take something from it and look back to it often. But thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video on Tuesday.